Welcome to our deep dive, all about the origins of Santa Claus.
Oh, this will be fun.
We'll be looking at historical accounts, folklore poems, all sorts of things, even a touch of psychology.
Psychology.
Yeah, to try to figure out how this jolly guy came to be.
Okay.
And you know what? Santa wasn't always that jolly red-suited fellow we all know.
Huh.
And even more surprising, there's actually a pretty interesting debate about whether telling kids about Santa is even a good idea in the first place.
Interesting.
So to help us unpack all of this, we have with us an expert in cultural history and folklore. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's dive right in.
Okay.
We all know the modern Santa, bright red suit, North Pole reindeer, the whole shebang.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to just dwell on that. I want to go deeper.
Okay.
So let's rewind the clock way back. Where does this global gift giver really come from?
Well, if we go way back, we land in 4th century Myra with St. Nicholas, a bishop known for his extreme generosity.
Ah, good old Saint Nick. Everyone knows him.
Right.
What's the story there?
One famous legend claims he secretly provided dowries for 3 poor sisters to save them from being forced into prostitution.
Oh, wow.
This act of selfless giving really resonated with people, and eventually the tradition of St. Nicholas Day gift giving on December 6th was born.
Interesting. So we have a 4th century bishop and a December 6th gift-giving tradition.
Yep.
How do we get from there to the modern Santa Claus we know today?
What's fascinating to see how this tradition evolved.
Okay.
Over time, that December 6th celebration kind of morphed into our modern Christmas celebration.
Makes sense.
But there's another character who comes into play here, Father Christmas, from 16th century England.
Wait, Father Christmas, wasn't he all about caroling and feasts, not necessarily gifts?
Exactly.
Okay.
He embodied the Christmas spirit, but in a way that was less about presents and more about good cheer and festivity.
Okay.
Interestingly, Charles Dickens really solidified this image of Father Christmas in A Christmas Carol, showing him as this joyful figure spreading Christmas cheer.
Right.
But wait, it gets even more interesting when we look at pre-Christian Europe.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's going on over there?
Well, during the Germanic midwinter celebration of Yule, there was this wild figure named Odin.
Odin.
Yeah. Now picture this long white beard riding an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir. Sound familiar?
Wait a minute. 8 legs? Is that where we get the reindeer from?
Maybe. And get this, there was also a tradition of gift giving during Yule.
Oh, wow.
So while not a direct one-to-one, there were some striking parallels between Odin and our modern-day Santa Claus.
I'm starting to see Santa in a whole new light. It's like he's this cultural mashup of different historical figures.
He really is.
Yeah.
And I think what's fascinating is why those figures blended together.
Yeah.
Early Christians were spreading their faith, but they were also smart.
Okay.
By incorporating existing traditions like Yule and its gift-giving figure, Odin, they made the transition to Christianity smoother and more appealing
Right.
to people who are already accustomed to those customs. It's a classic example of how traditions evolve by absorbing elements of what came before.
That's a clever strategy. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But how did this blend of Saint Nick, Father Christmas, and maybe even a sprinkle of Odin become the Santa we know today?
Well, fast forward to the 19th century, and we have the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas. You probably know it as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, published in 1823.
Oh, yeah.
This poem really cemented many of the traits we associate with the modern Santa, the sleigh, the chimney entrance, that big bag of toys.
I remember reading that every Christmas Eve as a kid.
Yeah. And then in the late 19th century, we have political cartoonist Thomas Nast adding to the mix. He's credited with giving Santa his home at the North Pole and picturing a whole workshop of elves.
That's cool.
It's funny, isn't it, how Santa's image became so Americanized despite his European roots?
Yeah, it's wild how all these pieces from different times and places came together over centuries. But speaking of Santa's journey, we have to talk about one of the most iconic parts of his story, the chimney entrance.
Oh, yeah?
Why a chimney? Of all the ways to enter a house.
The chimney is interesting because it's not unique to Santa. We see it with Odin, the Italian Befana, and of course St. Nicholas as well. It seems that in early folklore, the hearth was seen as this magical portal, a link between our world and the supernatural.
The chimney is a magical portal. I never thought about it that way, but it makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
And, I wonder if that idea of the hearth as a portal resonated with people because it represented warmth, safety, the heart of the home.
Okay.
Maybe it made those gift givers seem less intrusive,
Yeah.
more like welcome guests arriving at the symbolic center of the family.
That's a really interesting thought. It adds a whole new layer to the whole chimney tradition.
Yeah.
And of course, once Santa's using the chimney, you have to think about all the other traditions that spring up around that. Cookies and milk left by the hearth carrots for the reindeer.
Exactly. It's like this chain reaction of tradition building on tradition.
It really is.
And it's not just those tangible things.
Huh?
There are all those Christmas Eve rituals that we do, like reading "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" or singing carols that help create those magical memories.
It's those little rituals that really make Christmas Eve so special.
Mhm.
You mentioned regional variations earlier. I'm picturing families in Britain leaving out sherry and mince pies for Santa, while in Scandinavia, kids are setting out bowls of rice porridge.
Exactly. It shows how these traditions adapt to different cultures while still holding on to that core idea of welcoming Santa into your home on Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
But, as we're talking about all these traditions, it's making me think about Santa's laugh. I mean, it's so iconic. Where did that come from?
Believe it or not, ho 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 has a connection to the mischievous figure of Puck from English folklore,
Wait, Puck, as in fairy from A Midsummer Night's Dream.
the one and only.
What does he have to do with Santa?
It's fascinating. Both figures are associated with nighttime wanderings, gift giving, and even have a connection to chimneys.
Plus, that hearty ho-ho-ho echoes Puck's mischievous nature, adding a touch of playful energy to Santa's personality. It makes you wonder if there's a deeper, more archetypal connection between these figures, both representing a kind of mischievous generosity.
That's a cool connection. I'd never have put those two together. It makes you realize how much depth there is to even the smallest details of the Santa Claus story. But I think it's time to tackle the big question that many parents wrestle with. Is it ethical to tell children about Santa Claus?
The great Santa debate. To believe or not to believe that is the question. And our sources really highlight how complex this issue is.
What are some of the arguments for and against telling kids about Santa?
Well, on the one hand, some psychologists argue that believing in Santa Claus can actually foster critical thinking in kids.
Okay.
Think about it. They weigh the evidence. They try to figure out the logistics of how it all works.
Right.
And eventually they have this aha moment when they put it all together and realize the truth.
It's like a real-life detective story.
Exactly.
Encourages them to think for themselves.
But on the other hand, there's the argument that it's essentially a lie, and that erodes trust and might discourage healthy skepticism.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. It's a tricky situation for parents to navigate.
It is. What are your thoughts on it?
Honestly, I don't think there's an easy answer.
Me either.
I can see the value in encouraging imagination and critical thinking, but I also understand the concerns about trust and honesty. It's a decision each parent has to make based on their own values and what feels right for their family.
I agree. But, one of our sources mentioned a study about how kids actually evaluate the evidence for Santa's existence. They're not just blindly believing they're looking at the half-eaten cookies, the empty milk glass. It's like they're conducting their own little scientific investigation.
That's so interesting. It challenges the assumption that kids are just gullible. They're actually engaging with the idea of Santa on a much deeper level.
Right.
And that in itself is a form of critical thinking.
Exactly. And, another thing that really struck me was a psychologist's argument that believing in Santa isn't necessarily harmful because it's a cultural lie, not a personal one from parents. Kids understand that the Santa story is part of a larger cultural tradition, not a deliberate deception.
That's an interesting distinction. It's like how we tell kids fairy tales.
Hmm.
We know they're not real, but we still share those stories because they teach valuable lessons and spark imagination.
Precisely. And while some argue that any deception is wrong, others see it as part of the magic and wonder of childhood.
I think it's important to acknowledge both sides of the argument and encourage open conversations with kids as they get older and start to question the Santa Claus story.
Absolutely. Open communication is key.
Yeah. But I think it's also worth mentioning that beyond the debate, there's something really beautiful about this tradition that has brought families together for generations.
You're right. There's something about Santa Claus that transcends the arguments and speaks to our deeper human need for hope, magic, and the belief in something bigger than ourselves.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time we take a quick break. We'll be back in a moment to dive even deeper into the world of Santa Claus.
Sounds good.
See you in a bit.
I can't wait.
Yeah.
There's still so much to uncover. As we've been talking about Santa Claus, it's got me thinking about all the artists and writers who have shaped his image over time.
That's true. It's not just about the historical figures, but how they've been interpreted and reimagined through art and literature.
Right, like Clement Clarke Moore, for example.
Oh, yeah. 'Twas the Night Before Christmas.
Exactly. He wrote that back in 1823, and that poem really captured the public's imagination with those vivid images of the sleigh, the reindeer, the whole chimney entrance scene.
It's amazing how one poem could have such a lasting impact on how we see Santa Claus.
Huh.
What do you think it was about that poem that made it resonate so strongly with people?
Well, I think it tapped into that desire for magic and wonder, especially during the holiday season.
Right.
It presented this vision of Christmas that was enchanting, but also relatable with this kind, jolly figure bringing gifts and joy to children.
It's a classic for a reason.
It is. And then, of course, you have the illustrators like Thomas Nast, who further cemented that image in the late 19th century.
Yeah, his drawings are so iconic.
Yeah, with those depictions of Santa as a jolly bearded figure with a workshop full of elves at the North Pole.
And that image has stuck with us.
It really has.
I love looking at those old illustrations. They have a timeless quality to them.
They do.
But, we've been talking a lot about Santa.
Mm-hmm.
Makes me wonder, what about Mrs. Claus?
Ah, Mrs. Claus. She's a bit of a mystery, actually.
Really? I always assumed she'd been around as long as Santa has.
Well, she's a relatively recent addition to the whole Christmas mythology.
Interesting. So when did she come on the scene?
She didn't really become a prominent figure until the mid-19th century, and American authors had a big hand in popularizing her.
Okay. So before that.
Before that, she was kind of a shadowy figure, rarely mentioned or depicted.
So who is she? Is she just Santa's wife? Or is there more to her story?
She's definitely more than just Santa's wife.
Mm.
She's often portrayed as this warm, nurturing figure who plays a vital role in Santa's whole operation.
Right. Someone has to bake those cookies for the elves.
Exactly. She's like Santa's right-hand woman,
Ah.
his confidant and partner in spreading Christmas cheer.
It's heartwarming to think of them as a team, working together to bring joy to children all over the world.
It is. But it's interesting that she emerged so much later in the Santa Claus story. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, good question.
Well, it probably has something to do with changing social values and the evolving roles of women in society.
I can see that.
As women became more visible and active in public life, it makes sense that they'd start to be represented more prominently in cultural narratives, even something as traditional as the Santa Claus myth.
It's a reminder that even the most cherished traditions are constantly evolving,
Mm-hmm.
reflecting the times we live in.
That's true.
Speaking of evolving traditions, I think it's time we address the reindeer in the room.
Oh,
The whole question of Santa's existence and whether it's right to perpetuate this belief to children.
the Santa Claus debate. It's a topic that generates a lot of opinions.
It really does. We touched on it briefly before, but I know our listeners are eager to hear more about this
Of course.
and what our sources have to say.
So, as we mentioned, there are strong arguments on both sides.
Right.
Some people feel that telling children about Santa Claus fosters imagination, wonder, a sense of magic during the holidays. It's this harmless tradition that brings families together and creates lasting memories.
I can see that the anticipation and excitement of Santa's arrival is such a special part of childhood.
It really is.
Yeah.
And some psychologists even suggest that believing in Santa can encourage critical thinking skills.
How so?
Well, as kids try to make sense of the evidence,
Yeah.
they're looking for clues, piecing together information, and eventually they figure it out on their own.
So they're not just passively accepting what they're told, they're actually engaging with the idea, forming their own conclusions.
Right. But of course, there are also valid concerns about perpetuating a belief that will eventually be revealed as untrue.
Yeah, the potential for disappointment and a sense of betrayal.
Exactly. Some worry that it erodes trust between parents and children, and that it discourages healthy skepticism. They argue that it might be better to be upfront with kids from the start, even if it means sacrificing some of the magic.
It's a tough call for parents.
It is. It comes down to what you value most.
Right. Preserving the magic of childhood or emphasizing honesty and trying to avoid that potential disappointment.
And some even argue that you can still have the spirit of Christmas, the giving, the kindness, the time spent with loved ones, without necessarily needing Santa to deliver it.
Good point. You can focus on the real meaning of the holiday without relying on a fictional character. So what do you think? Is there a right answer to this debate?
Honestly, I don't think so. It's such a personal decision.
Yeah,
And each family has to weigh the pros and cons and decide what feels right for them.
absolutely. No judgment here.
None at all.
But, as we're talking about this, I'm curious. What are some of the arguments from our sources that stood out to you?
One quote that really resonated with me was from a psychologist who said, "Because it is a cultural, not parental lie, it does not undermine parental trust."
That's interesting. So the idea is that kids see it as part of a larger cultural tradition.
Right. It's not a personal deception from their parents.
Yeah.
It's like Everyone's in on it.
Right. And it highlights how important context is.
Exactly.
Kids are always taking in information from all around them,
They
and
are.
they're learning to distinguish between fantasy and reality.
Mm-hmm.
Santa Claus is just one piece of that puzzle.
It is. And another point that stuck with me was the idea that believing in Santa could actually foster those critical thinking skills.
Okay.
One study even found that kids who believed in Santa were more likely to question things and investigate evidence, even if it led them to a conclusion that wasn't true.
So it's not about making kids gullible.
Yeah.
It's about encouraging them to be more curious, more
Exactly.
analytical.
It shows that kids are capable of complex thinking, even when dealing with fantastical concepts.
I like that. But regardless of where you stand on the Santa debate,
Mm-hmm.
I think we can all agree that it's important to have open communication with kids.
Absolutely.
Let them ask questions, express their doubts, and ultimately come to their own conclusions.
I agree. Open communication is key.
So I think we've covered the Santa debate pretty thoroughly.
Yeah.
Now I'm ready to move on to some of the more intriguing, lesser-known aspects of the Santa Claus tradition.
Okay.
What are some of those hidden gems you found in the sources?
Well, earlier we talked about Santa's connection to Puck from English folklore,
Yeah,
especially with that ho-ho-ho laugh.
right. A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yeah, but there's actually more to that connection than you might think.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Tell me more. I love these unexpected connections in folklore.
Well, Puck, also known as Robin Goodfellow, is a mischievous fairy,
Okay.
often associated with trickery and illusions.
So a little less Santa, a little more Loki.
Kind of. He's a shapeshifter, loves playing pranks,
Hmm.
and he's always up to some mischief.
Okay. So how does he connect to Santa?
Well, both figures have this history of nighttime wanderings, gift-giving, and even a connection to chimneys.
Interesting.
In some stories, Puck even delivers gifts or rewards to those who please him.
Wow. So there's this parallel between these two figures.
There is.
Almost like they both represent this archetype of mischievous generosity.
It's a fascinating thought.
Yeah.
And it really shows how figures from different cultures and time periods can share these surprising similarities.
It's true. Folklore and mythology are always evolving,
Always.
borrowing from and inspiring each other in ways we might not realize.
Absolutely.
Speaking of unexpected connections, didn't we come across something about Santa and the Wild Hunt?
You have good memory. The Wild Hunt.
Yeah.
Now that is a truly intriguing piece of folklore.
It sounds intense.
It is. It's this myth found in various European traditions, especially in Northern Europe. Imagine this ghostly procession of hunters, often led by a supernatural figure riding through the night sky.
Okay, that does sound intense. How does this connect to Santa?
Well, remember how we talked about Santa possibly absorbing elements of the Norse god Odin? Well, Odin was associated with the Wild Hunt in some Germanic traditions.
Mhm.
And just like Santa, he was depicted as this bearded figure traveling through the sky, bringing gifts or rewards to those he deemed worthy.
So there's this link between Santa Claus and this ancient mythical tradition of this spectral hunt through the night sky that adds a whole other layer to the Santa Claus story.
It does. And it reminds us that even traditions that seem modern and lighthearted, like Santa Claus,
Right.
can have roots in some very old and sometimes spooky beliefs and practices.
It's amazing how all these threads weave together to create such a rich and complex cultural narrative. But what about the Wild Hunt itself? What was its meaning in those ancient traditions?
The Wild Hunt was often linked to the transition between seasons, especially the darker, colder months of the year. Some saw it as a harbinger of death or misfortune, while others associated it with the bounty of the hunt or the spirits of ancestors.
So it was a pretty multifaceted myth.
It was.
Different interpretations depending on the culture.
Exactly. But how does this tie back into Santa Claus? Well, as Christianity spread through Europe, it's thought that early Christians may have intentionally blended elements of the Wild Hunt and other pagan traditions into their celebration of Christmas.
So they were trying to create a sense of familiarity for people converting to Christianity.
Right. They could hold on to some of their old beliefs and customs while embracing the new faith.
It's a classic example of how traditions can overlap, influence, and even transform each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like they were saying, hey, you can still have your spooky nighttime procession, but now it's led by a jolly gift giver.
I love that. It makes the whole process of cultural evolution so much more understandable. But, as we're talking about all these different aspects of the Santa Claus tradition, I'm starting to feel a little overwhelmed by all the information.
I know what you mean. It's a lot to take in.
Yes.
But I think it's important to remember that at its core, the Santa Claus tradition is about celebrating the spirit of generosity, kindness, and joy. It's about those warm feelings we get when we think about giving gifts, spending time with loved ones, and experiencing the magic of the holidays.
That's a good point. Sometimes we get so caught up in the details and the history that we forget about the simple joy and wonder that these traditions bring to our lives.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes it so enduring and beloved. In a world that can often feel cynical and divided,
Mm-hmm.
Santa Claus reminds us that there's still room for magic, hope, and belief in something greater than ourselves.
Beautifully said. And on that note, I think it's time we move on to the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll explore some of the more practical and contemporary aspects of the Santa Claus tradition.
Sounds good. Let's unpack some of those modern day rituals and practices.
Excellent. I'm excited to get into those festive details and see what other fascinating insights we can uncover. Okay, so let's talk about some of those iconic modern day Santa rituals.
Yeah.
Cookies and milk carrots for the reindeer, the whole Christmas Eve spread.
Those Christmas Eve traditions are
They
fascinating.
really are.
These little acts of giving and anticipation that are just so ingrained in our holiday celebrations.
Right.
I mean, who hasn't put out a plate of cookies and a glass of milk for Santa, or carefully placed a carrot for Rudolph?
Oh yeah, I remember strategically placing the biggest, most delicious looking cookie right in front.
Right.
Like I was making sure Santa got the best one.
It's like you're participating in this big magical event.
Exactly.
And of course, like we mentioned before, these rituals have some fun variations around the world.
Oh yeah, for sure. Instead of cookies and milk, Santa might find sherry and mince pies in Britain,
Right.
or rice porridge in Scandinavia.
It's like each culture adds its own little twist to the tradition.
It's true. It shows how adaptable the whole Santa Claus thing is.
Hmm. And speaking of those little twists and turns, those ornaments on the Christmas tree,
Oh yeah.
they're a reminder of the gifts tucked away in another iconic Christmas container, the stocking.
Ah, the stocking. That little treasure chest just waiting to be filled with goodies.
But it wasn't always filled with goodies.
Right. Weren't there stories about kids getting coal if they were naughty?
Oh yeah, the coal in the stocking. A little reminder that Santa was keeping track of your behavior.
Like a lump of coal in your digital stocking.
Exactly.
It seems like Santa's gotten a bit softer over the years, though.
Maybe kids are just better behaved these days.
That's what I like to think. But, even beyond those tangible traditions, so much of what makes Christmas Eve special are the intangible things like reading "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" or watching those classic holiday specials.
Oh, absolutely.
I remember watching Rudolph and Frosty every year. It just wouldn't be Christmas Eve without them.
It's true. Those shared experiences create such powerful memories.
They really do.
It's about connection and tradition.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget about the carols.
The carols are essential.
Belting out "Santa Claus is Coming to Town with My Family" is a must.
There's something about Christmas music that just puts you in the holiday spirit.
It really does. As we talk about all these traditions, it makes me realize how much they've shaped how we see Santa. It's not just the historical figures, but all these beliefs and practices that have built up over time.
Right. It's like this snowball of Christmas cheer rolling through history and picking up new layers along the way.
Perfect analogy. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I have to ask, what are your final thoughts? What is it about this figure with all his complexities and contradictions that makes him so enduring?
I think it comes down to that basic human need for hope, magic, and belief, and something bigger than ourselves.
Hmm.
Santa represents those qualities.
Hmm.
The generosity, the kindness, the pure joy of giving.
It's true. Even if you don't literally believe in Santa, those values can stay with you.
Exactly. It's been a pleasure exploring all of this with you.
The pleasure's all mine. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope you've learned a thing or two about Santa Claus and maybe even discovered some surprising facts along the way.
And happy holidays, everyone.
Happy holidays! And until next time, keep on learning and keep on diving deep.